I remember the first time I ever saw the prairies. I grew up in southern Ontario, went to the University of Guelph, and for a summer job, I was working out in Alberta. I was driving my 67 Gold Camaro stick shift, 350 engine out, and coming out of northern Ontario, starting to see the prairies. And it was a sight that I will always remember. This afternoon we want to kind of look at the past and the future and what the grasslands are going to look like in 100 years' time. And are we going to plow them up, or are we going to be able to keep them? I've worked all my life with Agriculture Canada at Melfort and at Lacombe in the Aspen Parkland. And we worked a lot with cows and grazing. So basically, I learned everything from a cow. But this afternoon, we're going to talk about the management of the mixed grasslands in Western Canada. And those grasslands, as Jeff has pointed out, is basically in that area from Fort Macleod, Lethbridge, Drumheller, Rosetown, Unity, Biggar, Saskatoon, Moose Jaw, Regina, and Weyburn. So basically on the map, you can see there where we're talking about the area that I worked in was at Melfort, so that was in the Aspen Parkland on black soil, and later in Lacombe again in Aspen Parkland and in Lacombe area. But this is the grassland area that we're going to be basically talking about today, is in this area in here. And as part of that whole area, the biggest problem is trying to figure out where this grassland is and what it's being used for today. Recently, Mike Schellenberg, wave a hand, Mike, from Swift Current Research Station, Art Bailey, he's the emeritus range professor at University of Alberta, and myself, we put together a book on management of Canadian rangelands. And our idea there was to put together all the science and all the knowledge that we could find on the management of Canada's rangelands. The biggest problem we had was trying to find out how much rangeland do we have. And no one knows. We talked to Census Canada, and with many conference calls, we find out they only look at the land that farmers use. They don't look at community pastures, they don't look at the parks, any of that sort of stuff. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the most accurate, up-to-date information that we have on the amount of grasslands that we have in Canada. The unfortunate thing is, I'm not sure whether leased land was included in that. So here's the challenge then, being that a lot of you people are involved in remote sensing and mapping and that sort of stuff. I challenge you then is to put together an accurate database of the native grasslands that we have in Canada, because I'm convinced we don't know. Jeff alluded to where he got his data today, but if you use Census Canada data, there's a lot of it left out. So with this table that Mike and I and Art put together, as far as we're concerned, that's the start of where you should go from there. Now again, I was heavily involved in remote sensing in the early days in Melfort on Aspen Parkland pastures, and basically looked at 35 millimeter aerial photography, 9x9 aerial photography, and satellite imagery. So my buddy Tom, wave your hand. Tom's my next door neighbor in Alberta, and he works for the crop insurance people. And here's another challenge for the people that are involved in remote sensing. He's basically challenging you in this way. Traditionally, the work that I did and a lot of others was on a plot basis. We wanted to try and figure out how much biomass was growing in that plot. Tom's interested in the township level. So in crop insurance, he wants to be able to tell from this year to next year, did the amount of biomass in that township change enough to trigger an insurance payout? So here's the challenge then, to work with Tom and that group in developing other ways other than just on that plot basis, on a bigger scale of being able to look at productivity on rangelands that way. So there's the two challenges going out then to the mapping people that are in the audience. Okay, so let's go back in history. And it was really fascinating working with Art Bailey on this because he's a bit of a historian, and we looked at basically the growth of the Canadian cattle industry. So for 12,000 years, the grasslands were here. In the 1870s, the buffalo who roamed those ranges, it started to dwindle out. And at that point in time, they were shooting off the buffalo. It was being destocked, and the settlers were coming in. And in those years also, there was lots of moisture. Because the people were coming into the area, you had the traders, the First Nations, the Mounties, the people that built the railway. They all needed meat. So grazing pressures increased. And we had the establishment then of the first 2 ranches in Western Canada, all by outside people coming in. But they didn't last long. They only lasted to 1909, 1921. And why? The biggest problem was they put too many cattle on too small an area. When the Palliser Triangle, when the early explorers came out, they were basically saying the Palliser Triangle was unfit for farming. But that was because there was a period of drought years in that area. And the people in Ottawa, not knowing the area, basing their knowledge on Eastern Canada and European conditions then, they were then leasing out this land for $0.01 an acre, 10,000 or 100,000 acre blocks. We're having stocking rates first at 1 animal per 10 acres, then they had to change it to 20 acres, then they had to change it to 30 acres. And as long as you were grazing, you had the ability then to buy that land eventually, as what Jeff had talked about. In 1871 was the initial land survey, and all the land in the area then was divided up between the Hudson Bay Company. There was 2 sections of land in each township devoted to schools. There was CPR land given. Then there was homestead land given. And in 1912, that was the height of settlement. And we had a big government policy to break the grasslands. Ottawa says you have to break the grasslands if you want to stay. And this was something that baffled me. 1926, there was 2.25 million horses grazing the area. In 1912, we started seeing leases being abandoned because of overgrazing. 1925, there was a group of ranchers in southern Alberta were finding out that the stocking rates that Ottawa was saying you could have was not sustainable. So they got together and lobbied with the government, and finally, in 1927, the Many Berries Research Station was created, and that's way south of Walsh, Alberta, or in southern Alberta. Then in 1935, Swift Current Research Station was established with the sole idea in both of those places to look at grazing systems, watering facilities, reseeding, fertilizer on these abandoned lands. As settlement came coming then, we had the settlement coming in, we had the land being developed, there was that mad rush coming out west. World War I brought the increased demand for wheat, and the population was coming in to the west at wet periods of time in history. Then the drought came, the dirty 30s, and we had the Dust Bowl. And things were so critical then that people were moving from the south up into our area, into the Aspen Parkland area, just because of the moisture. And this is when the PFRA, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, got established, with the big goal then of creating remedies for this type of land that was being abandoned. So we had a cultural problem that had to be changed, where farmers had been encouraged to break the land based on European and Eastern Canadian farming conditions. And we also had the drought, so they had to manage the water systems. And that's where they started then of this program of diverting crop production from these poor lands and putting it back into permanent grazing. So in 1939, we had the introduction of the first 16 community pastures. And what was happening was, in rural communities, people would abandon their land. So there'd be these big trucks of land abandoned, not suitable for farming. So PFRA and later on the lands branch of Saskatchewan Agriculture came in, and they started to seed these with grass. And this is some of the equipment that they used in those days. In other words, the horses had been replaced now with tractors. This is some of the research work being done on the grass establishments at the Saskatoon Research Station, some of the early seeding equipment that was being used. And at that period also, in the 1960s then, at the Matador Research Center, which is about 40 miles north of Swift Current in Copeland, the famous grass ecologist from this university was instrumental in this. They set up, along with other places around the world, this was an international biological program, and for 10 years they did extensive research at the Matador Project. That is all summarized on foragebeef.ca, and if you're really interested, there's 26 volumes the size of the Toronto telephone book in the Plant Science Library. You can read it all. So everything you ever wanted to know about the Matador Project is there. Okay, so I come from the northern area, and I just wanted to kind of show you how land was broken in that area. We had to get rid of the aspen trees. The dozers would go into the winter time and shear them off at the bottom. They would brush them up into big piles. Most of it was done in the wintertime at 40 below so they could snap the trees on. Here's an area where 2 cats are driving huge logging chains down to bring down the aspen trees. Then they would pile them, they would wait a year, they would burn them, and then they would start the cultivation process with big discs. Those discs are like 2 feet in diameter. Those are big breaking discs. You had to use cats because tractors couldn't handle it. The land was very stony, so we used to have a seeder in front of a huge roller, and that was a boiler full of water. So that boiler was full of water, weighed 10 to 20 ton, and the seed box was in front. They would drop the seed down. That's how stony some of the land was, so you could really not work with that. So in that case then, you had to use aircraft, and here's the seed drill I brought in from central BC in the interior country, trying to take a look at that for roughland bush pasture. These are the famous rangeland seed drills coming out of Montana and North Dakota and Idaho. That's how that whole southwest or northwestern United States was seeded. Those drills look very good. And a lot of these drills then were used on community pastures by the Lands Branch people in Saskatchewan in the Aspen Parkland area. Then came the advent of other kinds of seeders. John Waddington, our good friend, now retired with Swift Current in Melford, he did a lot. He and I did a lot, along with Gary Bowes, did a lot of sod seeding into these kind of areas. We've published a booklet on everything you ever needed to know about sod seeding, and we're afraid to ask. And that's basically what we were doing, was putting strips of alfalfa in these kinds of land. Then along came the advent of the air seeders, and Ducks Unlimited were very interested in using air seeders for seeding native seed. And of course, if you worked with native seed, you know it's a very difficult seed to work with. And so we worked with PAMI, Prairie Farm Agriculture Machinery Institute, to develop agitation systems that could be adapted to all types of air seeders. So anyway, that was the kind of background on seeding. Now, as you all know, if it doesn't rain, it won't grow. So everything depends on water. If we look back in history, and Dave Shishin from the University of Regina has looked at drought periods over the years, over the past 300 years, and he does it by tree ring monitoring. And the interesting thing in the history books was the early fur traders trying to get to Fort Edmonton on the Saskatchewan River had to carry their canoes in places on the Saskatchewan because it was so dry, there was no water. So drought is always going to be with us. It's been there in the past, it's been there in the present, and we need to learn to be able to manage for drought on these grasslands. And as Jeff has pointed out before, there's sort of the range of precipitation on these different types of grasslands on an average type of year. Okay, so then let's look at where cows are. And a lot of times people say that all the cows and all the cattle are on the rangelands in southern Alberta. Vern Barron, the Lacombe Research Station, along with some PFRA people, have done an extensive study to find out exactly where the cow herds are in Western Canada. The majority of them are going to be in the parkland, and it's mainly because of the moisture. And those are beef cows per hectare on all pastures on the 2006. So the tan color then is where no data is, and the yellow color is where the highest number of animals are per hectare. So up in this area in here, and in the Yorkton, Brandon area. And there is the census then, including all the feedlots and all the farms with beef cattle. And again, the dark brown color is the highest, followed by the dark red. So that basically gives you sort of the demographics then in Western Canada of where the cattle are. Okay, number 2 thing, take-home message. If you don't remember anything from this presentation, I want you to remember that picture. It's a very famous picture. Alec Johnson, former research scientist at Lethbridge, many, many years ago. And it's the whole basis. In other words, when I talk to producers, you got as much grass above ground as you have roots below the ground. If you don't have the roots, you don't get the grass. The picture on the far side, anytime there was grass, they clipped it. Look at the amount of roots there. The one on this side, they at least left it to the 3 or 4 leaf stage before they clipped it. There's the amount of roots. It's the roots that drive the system. It's the roots that drives carbon sequestration. If you don't have roots, you don't have carbon sequestration. If you don't have roots, you don't have grass to graze on. A good friend in Brandon, Manitoba, many years ago, found out for every day you graze too early in the springtime on a continuous grazing system, you lose 3 days of grazing in the fall. Similarly, in Montana, our friend Lorenz at the Miles City Research Station found a very similar thing, only he looked at it in terms of animal months and that sort of thing. This group is also interested in carbon sequestration, and Brian's going to talk about that tomorrow. But the key thing there is to remember it's the roots that's the carbon sequestration. If you don't have the roots, you don't have the carbon sequestration. In putting this presentation together, I basically contacted all the top range people in Western Canada to get their ideas. And one of the fellows was telling me then, it's what we do before and between grazing events is far more important than what happens during that grazing event. Resting the plant is the only way to sustain a high production year after year after year. So it's resting the plant's most important thing. There's been a lot of talk about litter. And of course, coming from southern Ontario and coming from the Melfort area, litter wasn't a problem. I mean, you always had it on the ground. But I remember going with Barry Adams and Walter Wilms out to the Stavely project that they had, and there was a group of Chinese professors with us, and I'd always heard about Walter's study with the litter and all that kind of stuff. But really what woke me up was that Walter and Barry gave the Chinese professors a 5-gallon pail of water and a stopwatch. And we went into a grazed area, like a decimated area, and one that had lots of litter. And the idea, and it was on a hillside, and the idea was if they could pour the pail of water out on the top of the hill in the area that had very little litter and race down with the stopwatch at the bottom of the hill before the water got there. And the water ran down the hill, and like I'd never seen that before because there was no litter there. Jim Romo, University of Saskatchewan here, is finding basically for every kilogram of carryover in litter, he's getting a 20% increase in yield the next year. So the litter then is basically increasing the amount of water that will infiltrate into those soils. The other big thing on the rangelands we have to look at is this whole business of riparian issues. And traditionally it's been too long, too many cattle, and too often. Work out at Kamloops Research Station by a classmate friend, Doug Vieira, is basically finding that if possible, if there's a water trough provided, cattle will prefer to drink out of a water trough than go into the stream. And there's basically the data that he found where 79% of the drinking times were out of that water trough rather than in the stream. Walter also did a big study at Stavely looking at water quality coming out of dugouts versus out of wells versus cattle going in them. And for many years he could not figure out why the cattle were doing so much better on a water trough. And they finally figured out the calves could drink more water in the water trough than they could by going into the dugout. And so then it was advantageous then to have good dugout management. So in drought years then, and even before drought years, in the Aspen Parkland, and similarly down in the mixed grass countries, we tell the ranchers then, make sure that you've got lots of material there to catch snow trap for spring runoff to fill those dugouts. In lots of cases, we would go in and put up snow fences or portable windbreak fences just to trap snow so that we could fill those dugouts in the springtime. Again, Barry Adams and the public lands and the lands and fish, or the cows and fish people in southern Alberta have a big program in stream restoration. And so these are some of your projects then of being able to restore grazed out streams. Then there's the amount of biomass then that they are able to get on a recovered riparian area just by fencing management or by timing of grazing. And so there's all sorts of ways then of managing these riparian areas, and these are just some of the things that you can do to move those cattle around. The biggest problem facing the cattle industry, the grazing industry, and the mixed grassland industry today is where are we going to get winter feed? In Canada today, with a high price of canola and cereal crops, all land basically is being transformed into those high value cash crop areas. And we've looked at big studies in Lacombe of what's going to happen there. And basically what's happening is that it's far cheaper for us to extend the grazing season into the fall and into the winter time than it is to feed stored feed. And so what we're saying then is on the land that's available, going to be left for cattle grazing or cattle that's not being turned into canola or cash crops, we're going to have the most high productive crops possible on smaller acreages in order to sustain that big cattle industry. So we've looked at all different ways of using annuals for forage in the fall and in the summertime. We've looked at fertilizer. This work came out of Brandon, where they were looking at fertilized pastures, unfertilized pastures, finding that they were far better off to have a high mixture of alfalfa in those pastures that saved them 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Similarly, at Swift Current, Mike is finding that two legumes are most beneficial. Grasses alone are not giving them enough yield. So those are some of the things that are happening there. We looked at a lot of interseeding of legumes for grazing. We looked at annual legumes, and was published on that. Those are some of the ones in the parkland area that work the best, mainly because we have lots of water, and I think there is a big future for that in the green manure and cattle feeding industry. The other big thing that we've looked at all across Canada then is this whole business of swath grazing. That's where we will seed a crop of oats, barley, or triticale or corn, seed it mid-May to early June, swath it in the soft dough stage just before the freezing frost, and then we'll graze it in the wintertime. And the cattle can graze through 2 feet of snow in that, and I've now been swath grazing I started as a swath graze in 1994, and they've been doing it ever since. There's a possibility of being able to save some of the area for an area to bring those cows and calves out after calving in the springtime rather than putting them on the perennial pastures too early in the spring. There's rough fescue coming through the wintertime. Rough fescue is best grazed in the wintertime. That's basically when the buffalo grazed it because they were on the plains in the summer, but they came up into the aspen parkland to graze in the wintertime. And there is cattle then grazing on that in the wintertime. There's cattle grazing meadow brome alfalfa through the snow. I highly recommend doing that late in the fall as opposed to in the freezing, in the snow conditions, mainly because a lot of the alfalfa leaves were knocked off. There's meadow brome grass in February into the snow. You'll see the amount of greenness. At Brandon, they have a hot summer, so their pastures peter out on them. So what they're looking at then is grazing these annuals in the summertime and letting their permanent pastures recover in that May, June, or that July, August type period. Another thing that people do is bale grazing, and they'll place the bales out on a field and they'll strategically graze those during the wintertime. But we need to look at all of these operations then is what is the amount of land that's needed for 100 animals. So again, Vern Barron has put this table together, and there's the number of pasture days that we were able to get in grazing those. We had a carrying capacity then per hectare of 1,152 animal grazing days per hectare on the triticale, where we had 219 days on that brome alfalfa pasture that I showed you before. The trick was that I had hayed that brome alfalfa field in June, sold the hay off. It was the regrowth that we were grazing. And there's basically the number of acres then, or the number of animals the number of acres required then to run 100 animals over that period of time. Okay, so he looked at then for 100 cows grazing 100 days, you could use 9 hectares of land under triticale, and it was 45 hectares of land under the grass to winter those animals. Okay, so with that in mind then, let's look at what's it going to look like in 100 years. And as I mentioned before, as Jeff has mentioned before, there's going to be climate change. We're going to see lots of variability. We're going to see long-term drought versus high moisture periods of time. We need to be able to sustain our capacity. We have to plan for those variations in weather, so feed storage then becomes ultimate important. One of the really neat things that I've seen lately, because when I was in Melfort, I'd always hear about the people down in Val Marie with the Queen's cattle. And the Queen's cattle were the deer and the mule deer getting into the haystacks. Well, the people in the Peace River Forage Association have developed a system where they put 2 lines of electric fences spaced about 5 to 6 feet apart all the way around their bale yards. And that's keeping the deer out. The same thing with their swath grazing fields. So that in the south then, if cattle getting, or the wild animals getting into your bale yards, take a look at the Peace River Forage Association website, and they have all the diagrams and the information there on how to put up those fences, and they were really looking at working. The other point coming out of some of the people saying about the climate change things was maximizing our genetics for those kind of things, and they felt there were some real opportunities to be had. So as I mentioned before, then I contacted 10 of the most, who I respect the most, range managers in Western Canada, and asked them 2 questions. The number 1 question was, in the future, what are the most critical things that you see happening or causing problems in the mixed grass prairie? The number 2 question was, do you think we can put more grazing animals on that land? Beef Cattle Research Council had a big meeting in February. This is the number 1 thing that they brought out of that meeting, was this whole business of the research cuts and capability of people in research being not around. The other major thing from other people coming was this whole business of competing land, canola versus grazing land. The whole definition of marginal land. Like in the 80s, Census Canada called it wasteland. Like, what is wasteland? No wonder people don't have a high regard for rangeland. And the whole idea of bringing in the plows. We were finding that forage production was being lowered, and it's most likely because of the high cost of fertilizer. So that in the future, we're going to have to see fertilizer being put on some of these lands. What was the contribution of carbon sequestration, watersheds, biodiversity, the whole business of dirt bikes coming in to the area? We need the research to figure that out. With the high land cost, there was a glimmer of hope because calf prices were high, and maybe we can resort to that. Most Canadians think that we have a lot of grassland. It's extremely difficult to get research funding, and talking to 2 of the researchers in Western Canada, they basically have given up trying to do research in mixed grasslands because they can't get any research funds from the industry. And they are finding that it's more important in the economy then to drive the big trucks, the gas guzzlers, than just to look after this kind of land. In Alberta, in talking to the range people there, they're basically saying that the majority of the rangelands in Alberta are in a healthy condition. Their biggest problem then is government decisions in the future, and it's not the grazing managers or the grazing leasees as are the problem. It's the problem of the impact of people that have not come from the range background being in government, being in policy, making those decisions at a distance. Another big problem was the whole idea of calling it public lands. Well, the general people say, well, it's called public lands and it's my land, so I should be able to figure out how that land should be managed. When this land basically is being leased to ranchers and grazers, the other people want to have input. One of the big concerns in Alberta is there's a private member's bill coming up that would call for a complete public consultation on any new land that where a grazing lease was going to be renewed. All sorts of stakeholders having an involvement in that land, and they've got lots of political clout. In recent times then, the major thing in mixed grasslands is this whole imprint on the oil and gas industry, coming in on what Jeff and Barry have talked about before. And it's extremely important then that we're still able to monitor these lands, and there's a new criteria coming out, have come out in Alberta in 2010 to be able to help manage that. One of our daughters-in-laws is involved in Alberta in looking after these kinds of lands. Bigger concern, other than oil and gas in Alberta, is this business of windmills and methane, cold methane gas coming in. And in our area, there's going to be hundreds of new windmills come in. So as Barry and Jeff says, that there's going to be roads, there's going to be power lines all across that landscape. And with this electrical generation, it's going to be there basically forever. As Barry has mentioned before, is this whole business of fragmentation of the rangelands coming in. This is how they used to put pipelines in. There's the amount of rangeland was disturbed. They're now looking at minimal disturbance systems of going in. And again, these are all the different kinds of disturbances coming onto those kinds of land. These are some of the techniques that they're able to use in restoring this land afterwards. And I'd always heard of the guys talking about, these invading species and leaving marks across the prairies. And until recently, I finally figured out what they were talking about. And people would go in and they would seed, say, with some species that wasn't native to that particular area, and you'd see these great big strips across the grassland. Now what they're looking at is having to reseed those areas in the same kind of material that was found before they put the strip in. There's a picture from the Sheffield research station, or not research station, the military station, and you can see the patch of green going all the way across that area from the species that they planted that were not the same as before. And as mentioned before, there's a diagram in red of all the different marks and things coming across that landscape. So, one of the other big problems that we have is the departments that are being looked after in the government after these range like public lands or lands branch in Saskatchewan being bounced around between different departments. And that's causing all sorts of problems because there's a loss of continuity. The other big problem is grasslands have no legal rights. And in Saskatchewan, if there's gravel and there's potash, the gravel comes first, the potash comes second, and the rangelands is way down on the list. So that's why we're seeing so much of this fragmentation. Land stewardship is another big thing. With the young people coming back onto the range or onto the farm, they don't have the historical background of being able to manage these lands. We have a lot of absentee landlords that are buying up the land, and will they basically manage these lands like the people in historical times have done? So cattle then, there's a method of being able to use those animals to be able to control the grazing. There was just all sorts of other comments that the people were having to bring forth to this meeting, and it was basically saying that we need to really put emphasis on this conference to move the information up into the policymakers' hands so that they can decide accurately what should happen with those lands. So the research efforts need to be directed to understanding the role of cattle in producing the healthy ecosystem. There's this whole business of cattle-free movement. We have to be able to counteract that, but we have to have the economic and social type of research to back up the reasons why we need to keep the grasslands. And they say, yeah, sure, the grasslands can be managed better, but people are doing a very good job at the point. One of the researchers is saying it's not about livestock. Livestock's an important industry, but one which needs to be supplemented to sustain the rural communities with other types of income. Overgrazing still is a problem in some of the areas. It's all very complex. Big problem in research reduction. However, one good thing, University of Alberta has just received a ranch north of Hanna, and it's going to become a research ranch, and they are in the process of hiring a range ecologist there. But we need to be able to provide guidance then for that person in the kind of research that they will be doing in that area. Again, still more of the comments coming in from these people because they had lots of concerns of the different things going on. And basically they're saying this, that we have to get rid of this whole idea that grazing is a bad thing. There'll still be that role of climate coming in. And I thought this one was really good. This came from my friend, he's the chairman of the Society for Range Management, which I was heavily involved with. And basically what he's saying is over the 60 years that he's been involved, he's seen devastation, but now he's really seeing improvement. So there is hope, and he is saying that people are taking a care and a need in this, and that there is a light at the other tunnel, and that as we spread this knowledge around, we'll be able to increase these practices. Big problem in Canada right now is this whole business of the community pastures being eliminated. And I guess what it comes down to this group here today, if you want to really make this workshop done or well or fruitful, we need to get this kind of information then to the new minister in Saskatchewan. There's a new Minister of Agriculture in Alberta. We needed to get to those policymakers of the whole business of what's going to happen to these grassland areas. The forage councils in Saskatchewan and Alberta have done an excellent job in trying to put together the value of the forage industry. You need to be able to take that information and get it out into the public to make them aware of that kind of thing. We need to be able to protect these landscapes other than plowing them up. The biggest question we have to answer to the public is, what is the economic and social values of the grasslands? That's the biggest question we have to answer. And we have to get that information out. It's no sense having it in a scientific paper because people don't read them. There's where the PFRA pastures were. They're going to get rid of them all. In the press it says that the former Minister of Agriculture in Saskatchewan wants to sell them. Is that what we really want? We need to have some system in there that we can still manage those lands and they're not turned into canola fields. There's the number of pastures that the Saskatchewan Agriculture Pasture Program have. They're all well managed. We have to show the policymakers the value of those lands. And I challenge this group to get the ministers of agriculture and the deputy ministers of agriculture out in a pickup truck and drive them across some of these landscapes. Because I question whether any of them have ever been there. Do they really know what the grasslands are all about? As I mentioned before, Mike and I and Art have put together this booklet. It's on the website. It's also available in print. See Mike for a copy. And as I mentioned before, we've put all the information that we could get on forage and grasslands and beef production on foragebeef.ca. It's a huge library. Let everybody know because it's all applicable to Canadians and to the Americans. We do have some researchers, but they do need your help. They need your input. We only basically have 4 people that I'm aware of doing research in grazing, range management, that sort of thing. And one person says, well, they got $1 million to be able to do research. Do you realize that that only supported 3 research projects for 3 years? On average, the lowest price, it costs us $100,000 a year to do any kind of research, okay? After 3 years, you've only got the thing established. We need to be able to take that on into society. And I guess the big question I'm asking today is, does our society want to be responsible for the extinction of the Canadian prairie grasslands? So the time is now. We need to act quickly. There was a committee formed 2 weeks ago in Saskatchewan to give the Premier advice. This group needs to be in contact with those people on that committee to give them some ideas. And that's that.